Hey folks, Layman Pascal here with my pal Integral Ask Prof. Matt Segall for our third Integral official conversation about religion and economy. Today I want to talk about profit, something I think we all think we know about, but almost never think about deeply. I'm interested in the qualitative and quantitative asymmetries of markets and cosmoses. To give you a taste of what I mean, maybe you remember the 1980s joke religion, the Church of the Subgenius. They worshipped a super salesman named J.R. Bob Dobbs who could wheel and deal on our behalf with Jehovah and the other alien space gods who rule this world. Bob's powers came from a mystical quality they called slack, which he would share with you for a small fee. And they defined slack as getting something for nothing. And that's kind of what profit is. It's not getting something, and it's not just the revenue deserved by an endeavor. It's the positive discrepancy between how much you put in and how much you get out. So I'm inviting Matt to help me flesh out the theology of the 21st century temple of the plus one. Anybody with a critique of economy and an interest in Whitehead's process philosophy will probably have something interesting to say about how you take everything and add it together and then get a little something extra out of the process. And I'll be thinking in terms of what I've been calling to myself subtractive and additive surplus. Subtractive is the extra, the profit that you get by taking something from somewhere else in the system. If you get a bunch of bonus money by borrowing it, you've sort of subtracted it from your own future. And the Marxist take is often that the profit in a capitalist enterprise robs the value of the worker's labor. On the other hand, something like additive profit doesn't necessarily take from somewhere else. Maybe it comes about by magic, like the universe emerging from the void. Maybe it's a gestalt effect from the integration of the parts, put them together in the right way, and the configuration itself is an extra. Maybe it's like a refinery where you change the quality of the substances, and the new refined substance counts as if it were an extra substance. Maybe it's a hormesis type overreaction where we build up energy for something that doesn't happen, and we've got a little bit extra laying around. Anyway, that's my opening bit on the transdisciplinary logic of profit and extra. What's your current take and or mood, Matt?
Thank you, Layman. Great to be with you again. Perfect topic for our moment. When you asked me to talk about this a few weeks ago, I was like, oh yeah, that's always relevant. And then this whole GameStop attack on the hedge funds happened. And it's like, it brings a whole new perspective on the importance of understanding what profit is and how it's made by the movers and shakers that shape our economy and thus our world, which is increasingly every aspect of human life is economized, commodified. You can buy and sell not only what is materially present, but you can buy and sell what might be materially present in the future. You can bet against companies failing. You can bet against the future, and something like 90% of the money that exists is a derivative that it doesn't even refer to anything material, really. It refers to what that material might become. And so we're living in a highly immaterial economy. And profit seems to be the engine by which capitalism produces this immaterial value that's detached from our actual earthly existence and social relationships with one another. And so, my mood generally these days is one of anxiety and overwhelm because of the waves of breakdown and the collapse of one institution after the next. I mean, Trump was like, the White House as an institution and the presidency as an institution being destroyed. Like, Trump's gone, but the institution cannot recover from it, I don't think. So now it's like Wall Street, which maybe people on the left and the right could all agree is an institution we would want to take down. It also seems to have been mortally wounded in some sense. There was a chink was discovered in the dragon's armor, and it's going to be, even if they can block that little piece, a strategy has been devised for mass decentralized action against Wall Street, and people are aware of this tool now, and it's not going to be unlearned. Even if GameStop itself doesn't pan out in the way that the Redditors are hoping. So, I think you brought up Marx. I'd love to get more into what Marx has really uncovered and unveiled and demystified about the capitalist mode of production, the relationship between wage slaves and landlords and capitalists and owners, right? There's a relationship there that people who earn a wage don't always fully understand, or maybe people that, wage earners nowadays, people that are making minimum wage or working hourly, they're working class. Like they're more potentially aware of what Marx is pointing to and the way that they're being exploited. But then there's this middle class layer that like buffers the capitalists from the working class, the professionals, the managers, the people who are salaried. Like they're led to believe that they're making a profit somehow because they don't really have to work quite as hard, and they get to tell other people what to do, and they're salaried, so, and that they have like contracts, and that they feel, more valued by the owners, but they're still not owners, and then it creates this jealousy thing where the working class people, like, they hate the managers, and they also hate the capitalists, but they want to become managers too at the same time. And so there's this internal struggle to, like, do I just work within the system and work my way up, or do I, reject it? And what are the options for workers who reject the system nowadays? Like, unions have been pretty much destroyed in the last decades, and most of the unions that do exist are corrupt anyways. So workers are in a bad spot. Professionals and managers, I mean, I'm in there, are increasingly left wing in their economic, proposals and allegiances, but they're still letting the workers continue to suffer in their comfy middle class existence, buffering them. And so where are we right now? I mean, is Marx relevant? Yes, as a critique, but how we move forward, I don't know that Marx necessarily gave us the answer, or at least his answer was, hey, let capitalism do its thing. It will overcome it. It will produce the conditions for its own overcoming, technologically and socially. And, maybe Marx hoped it would have happened sooner, but it does feel like some kind of a accelerationist view of how we get out of capitalism would be most accurate. But yeah, maybe let's start with Marx and the critique.
Sure.
And then move on to what he left out and where to go now.
Then I want to come into more cosmological territory later on, because I think there's an odd parallel to, like, Eros, or how is it that more shows up in universes? But we'll get.
I think we can get cosmological right in Marx's labor theory of value.
Let me summarize what I understand Marx to be saying, and this is ignorant in a lot of ways. I have not carefully read and reread Capital, and it's charitable. I'm going to give an ignorant and charitable rendition of Marx. I'm not interested in where he's gone wrong. I'm interested in what I think of that might be true when I think of him. My sense of Marx is he's saying that there is a structural, almost an algorithmic flaw within capital systems. The capital markets can accomplish a lot of good. However, they also accomplish a lot of evil. And they have a built-in self-limitation based on the underlying structure of how things are going. And that limit is that the profit never really represents the value of what's going on. You take these resources, including, if we're taking a big view, resources and investments and all the stuff you need. Then you take all the people who do all the work to transform the stuff into goods and services, and then you sell that to someone. Now, why isn't that a balanced equation? Why don't you sell it for the exact same amount that it costs you to make it? Well, there'd be no incentive to do it that way. So you have to be selling it for more than you made it. Obviously, that's business. But where does that more come from? You pay the costs of the resources you use, and then you give them out. You use them up. So that's kind of flat. So the only place where the extra can come from is either charging the consumer more than it's worth, or paying the workers less than the worth of their time. And then the money that the consumers had to get ripped off is only the money they got from selling their time for hypothetically less than it was actually worth. So the fact that you've got a +5 coming out of this equation means mathematically that you probably had a -5 somewhere in that equation. Somebody got screwed in order for there to be apparently more at the end of the process than the beginning. And if you keep running this process and redistributing the results, you end up with a system whereby you have to sabotage yourself. You kind of have to continually make things cheaper or worse. You have to underpay people and they will turn against you. You have to do all kinds of bizarre moves to keep this system working because it's fundamentally imbalanced in its underlying logic. It's like a boat that's leaking, and you can take the water from the front of the boat and dump it at the back, and it seems like you've solved the problem. But it's still leaking, and you have to constantly develop new schemes for keeping it from failing because the failure is built into the inherent logic. Now, I don't think Marx prophesizes necessarily an inevitable failure of capitalism, but I think he does describe the fact that this inherent contradiction is going to keep it trying to fail all the time. Now, there's no limit on the ingenuity of people who are going to try to prevent that failure, but unless they keep trying to prevent that failure, it will fail. So that's my impression of the Marxist argument. What's your take on the Marxist argument?
Yeah, I think I'm mostly on board with how you've characterized things. I would want to point to a few important features of capitalism as a mode of production that, including how it emerged historically with land enclosure and what Marx called primitive accumulation. And so when we, in that context, and how capitalism expanded and became corporatized through the colonization of new land and new labor, which initially was enslaved. And so there's an abstract account of capitalism in terms of the labor and the labor theory of value and the relationship between the profit that's being made and what the laborer is being paid to produce what's being sold. But there's also this historical context, which I think is important to remember when we talk about capitalism and why the people that are very wealthy today are wealthy, how that money was initially produced. It was, yes, exploiting wage laborers, but it was also exploiting at an even far deeper level slaves and also the natural world. Now, of course, slavery preexists capitalism by a long shot. However, never before had profit been what was driving slavery. Slavery was something that, you beat your neighbor's tribe and in a war, and then the survivors kind of end up as these lower class enslaved people but they're kind of part of the family too at the same. And it's not that all slavery was like that. There were harsher forms of it in the ancient world, but never for profit. And it was usually for one generation. It wasn't harvesting people to be workers into perpetuity. I mean, that's a unique feature of North and South America under colonial rule. So that's important historical context that I think it's forgotten, as if capitalism is just the science of economics and of supply and demand. It's it's also a power structure, a hierarchy formed historically due to the use of violence. And so if human history is to have a brighter future, or rather if the human future is to be brighter than our history, I would think we're going to need to address the trauma of the violence that capitalism has inflicted, not just on workers, not just on slaves when slavery was still legal, and for all intents and purposes, it still seems to be in many places, but also just inheriting.
What do you mean by that? Address the trauma? What would that look like?
Well, psychologically,
that's something you have to wait until you've gone beyond capitalism in order to do, or is it something you have to start doing before you go beyond capitalism? And on a social level, how do we address those inherited traumas?
Well, I mean, I think in the same way that like the ancient Israelites would have rituals of lament where they would gather together as a community, or the ancient Greeks would do it in the theater. And, we have different ways of processing this in the modern world, but nothing at the scale that would be required. Like in the United States, we could fill up every one of our giant football stadiums and engage in a collective ritual, mediated with the screens and stuff, to relive our history and to just all like cry together about it. Or it could be more distributed and we engage, in more local groups. We don't have to do the stadium thing, but, different people could participate in different sorts of rituals of collective lament. I don't know how we, plenty of people might be motivated to do something like that, and plenty of people might be enraged by the very idea that there's anything to atone for. America, we ended slavery. What are you talking about? I don't know really how to address the trauma I'm speaking to, but it seems evident in our behavior as political animals today that it seems evident that trauma is at play. And if we engage these economic questions while pretending that there isn't this emotional base of trauma underlying our behavior, then we're missing, I think, most of what's motivating us. And we're missing potential avenues into a better economic system. There's that aspect of capitalism, but, to make it cosmological, when we talk about the labor theory of value that undergirds everything Marx is saying, and like neoclassical economists will critique Marx's labor theory of value, and if you can destroy that, nothing else for Marx can follow. Like his whole critique of capitalism collapses. And so the idea there that human labor it's our capacity to it's our metabolic relationship with nature, and it's our ability to engage with nature, to apply our thinking and our willing capacity to bring forth, to liberate a profit from nature, to liberate energy, to be used for our own purposes. And, prior to capitalism, the only value we human beings knew of was use value, a sense of, and I mean capitalism in the most general sense, so not just the form that started like during the Renaissance, but the whole idea of it's the difference between exchange value and use value, where use value is more about satisfying your needs as a human being in the material world. And it's not that through engaging with nature in an intentional way that we might not produce new needs in ourselves, like new desires. So it's not that this would be a static, like, well, I got to grow food and build houses, and that's really all I need to do. I think there's still a productivity, even if you're only, and a creativity, even in the realm of use value alone. But exchange value is this, it implies a hierarchy between those who are doing the labor and those who own the means of production, including the very land upon which those laborers are working, right? And so capitalism is the ownership over the means of production, such that the people who are making the products in the material world that we need to use to survive and to be happy are working way more than they need to produce those things, actually, in order to produce a profit for the owners. And so it's not just like a flaw; it's an injustice. It's a hierarchy that's not rooted in any sense of like merit. It's a hierarchy that's rooted in pure power. If you look at it historically, which is what I started talking about, right? And so the human relationship to nature, labor is our metabolic relationship to the natural world. And I think a model we might want to orient ourselves around when we think about a future economy that doesn't have this hierarchical rift in it would be one wherein we pay attention to the sun as profoundly generous in the way that it gifts energy freely to the earth. It produces a huge thermodynamic surplus, right? Such that plant life like emerges on the surface of the earth as a relationship between the temperature gradient of deep space, which is really cold, and sunlight, which is warm, and the surface of the earth reflecting the sunlight. It frees up energy on the surface, negative entropy, we could call it, which is it's a stimulus energetically for life to emerge, to break down that gradient by producing entropy, and thereby bringing radiating heat away from the earth in an attempt to reach equilibrium with the temperature of space. And so the generosity of the sun and the relationship between life on earth, particularly plant life, is the original gift economy. It is nature's communist economy. And even, fruits, plants give rise to fruits and vegetables that we can eat. And, they don't ask to be paid for any of that. And so I think in some way we need to look to that ecological and cosmological relationship as a model that can be technologically imitated, and maybe find our way through this evolutionary bottleneck.
Wow, there's so many good themes in there. The first thing I think of is, the sun is like the subtractive theory of profit I was talking about. We're taking something from its energy system and it's counting as a profit within our local terrestrial energy system. Now, you can think of that subtraction as a taking, but you can also think about it, like you said, as a generosity, as a gifting. But then the flip side of that is, maybe that's how I think about the excess value I'm taking from the workers. I think of it as their gift to me. They're just generous. They're inherently generous. So I've got that on my mind. I recalled my impression from Marx that as capital drives technological innovation and we automate more processes, it should give us more free time. But if the profit is only coming from what they snag out of the labor time of the workers, including themselves, they're also workers. I've been an employer, and you also get screwed. You're underpaid for your time as well. But if everything gets efficiently automated, then there's no profit in the Marxist system. So you can't actually harness technology to make the world a better place where people have more free time if the profit that causes the economy to grow is based on snagging something from people's labor time, from the amount of their free time that they converted into labor. And so Marx anticipated these turbulent moments in capital where its very attempt and its efficiencies would undermine its own profit motive. And then it would have to do something, have to reset or change its territory or something like that. I really liked you bringing in the slavery thing, because there's a huge class of people whose labor is undervalued, right? The absolute example is the slave. Their labor time is paid nothing. The wage slave or the employee gets a certain amount, but it's never what their effort is actually worth, or there wouldn't be any profit on the other side. And I think it's absolutely true that the entrepreneurs themselves, right? A lot of people who run businesses can't afford to pay themselves. And that's another version of, you're not getting what your time's worth in this kind of a setup. And it does lead to suffering, right? In the slave's case, the suffering is very obvious. In the case of the entrepreneur and the employees, there's a lot of emotional malaise, a lot of stress, a lot of meaninglessness, a lot of missed opportunities in the rest of your life. So everybody is inheriting a lot of suffering from this system, and that will have to be addressed somehow. And perversely, I almost wonder if, some people's moods are going up because some other people's moods are going down. Is there an emotional profit? Is our well-being getting skimmed and deliver it
Yeah.
to somebody else.
I used
That's
to
a
call
great deal.
this the conservation of psychic energy is how I used to think about that. You know, someone's getting happy over here, and well, someone must be sad over there because it has to all. There's only so much psychic energy to go around, right? I mean, maybe.
That's my question in a way. Like, that's the subtractive version. If there's only as much as there is, and if
Mhm.
somebody gets more, then it's only because somebody else got less. On the other hand, is that how the cosmos works? Is there novelty, new value? Do things come out of nowhere? Is anything added to the system? I'm not sure how to reconcile these two takes on the production of extra.
Well, I think the example of the sun's relationship to the earth, to life on earth, is an example of extra, of excess, of surplus that is natural.
Yeah.
And humans engaging with nature, applying their thought and their will to produce, to design environments and technologies that enhance life, that make one's existence more interesting, more beautiful, that allow us to know and understand more about the world around us. I think capitalists will often, who want to defend that system, will say, well, capitalism gave us all this great technology and comfort. And I think we achieved all that despite, I mean, so much of our technology nowadays that we depend upon was a product of the space program. That was a pretty communist operation. In terms of the government funding and the government scientists and the government everything. We planted an American flag on the moon because of human ingenuity that wasn't driven by the profit motive. I mean, obviously there are technological and wartime applications, but the military itself, I think, needs to be, if we're going to have a post-capitalist future, we have the military, the US military is like the largest communist institution that's ever existed on the planet, you know, in terms of how individuals are organized for a common purpose. And we can repurpose it and need to. And I've heard more people on the left starting to talk about this. But in any event, what you're bringing up about the question of surplus, I think, is the site of the most important critique of capitalism, because we can distinguish between the creativity of nature and the way that human beings, when they own their own time and they don't have to sell their time and their labor to someone else who's skimming off 90% of that for profit, when we can engage nature directly with our own productive and creative powers, then we become, I mean, that's what it would mean to not be alienated from the cosmos anymore. That's what it would mean for the human to become a cosmic being again, and not just imagining that we're some kind of a bot in a simulation, which seems to be like the default phenomenology of late modern existence. I feel that way frequently, you know, and it's only like meditating on what this warmth of light on my face coming through the window is. It's like meditating on that seems to be one of the few ways to escape the late capitalist condition of being so heavily mediated and so heavily alienated from the material conditions by which we are brought forth in each moment. But at the level of those material conditions, I mean, yeah, in a Whiteheadian sense, in each moment, the universe is giving birth to a miniature version of itself, every point of space, and the universe is reproducing itself in the form of infinitely many mirrors, which produce a beautiful and ordered mosaic. And we're participants in that process. And so I think once we've liberated ourselves from this alienated form of social relationship, and once we've overcome this alienation from nature, and so such that we can engage consciously in that metabolism between human and cosmos, then I cannot. I mean, it just strikes me as a beautiful beautiful image, and it's increasingly difficult for me not to see capitalist social relations and the capitalist mode of production as at least one of the obstacles standing in the way of something like that.
That makes me think of Dr. Wilhelm Reich. And, in his life, he went from therapist to biologist to social activist to a kind of weird life energy physicist. But there's a very interesting philosophical arc there where first he's dealing with people's alienation from their own experience in the Freudian sense. So there's some extra. There's some extra somewhere relative to my experience that I'm not getting. I'm cut off from the profit of my own emotional relationship to being an embodied creature, right? And then he becomes a Marxist and a trans-Marxist because he's thinking about how people are alienated from the products of their labor, both physically, mentally, as well. But then he's also thinking at the end of his life about how we're alienated from the cosmos. We know there's a something more, whether we think about that through the metaphor of a pervasive life energy or not, or a god or something like that. There's something about the cosmos that strikes us as having extra value, that makes everything else worthwhile. That's the incentive for the whole system. And generally, we don't feel connected to it. The experience of that surplus would have to be more distributed in our experience. We look out the window and we see it in the sunlight, or we experience it as non-dually pervasive through the whole system. That's a redistribution of the extra that we perceive in that system. So, there's a real interesting parallel between Marxist critiques of society and a kind of mystical critique of being a person in the cosmos.
Right. So I think we cannot stop learning from Marx about the problems with capitalism. But I think, in some of the ways that you were already pointing out, Layman, even people who are nominally owners, small business owners, are also getting screwed by the system. And I think one of the things that Marx didn't seem to factor in to his labor theory of value is that, many business owners pay rent for their facilities. Many business owners still owe debt on loans to start their businesses. And at the end of the day, the banks that, give businesses credit cards and the insurance companies that give you a policy, like these larger institutions there's always a bigger capitalist in the background. And so all of the conspiracies about like some upper echelon of like lizard kings that are controlling everything, there really are a very small number of people who have tremendous economic power. They're not really lizards, they're just people. But the thing about the nature of this system and the psychological mindfuck and traumatic historical process that we're all going on is that even those people at the top are, I'm sure, suffering tremendously. I think having some wealthy friends who are very charitable, I can understand how difficult it can be to figure out how to give it away, and the agony of wanting to make not just throw it away, but give to an organization or a group or someone who's going to do something good with it, not do something bad with it, and like be part of the solutions to the system that created your wealth that you don't feel like you deserve. And it's not easy to be at any level of this hierarchy. And Marx's very politically polemical, revolutionary sort of energy, and the mottos that come out of that, like "eat the rich." I know most people who use those sorts of phrases don't mean it literally, but I'm not always sure. And I'm not saying there aren't plenty of very wealthy people who deserve to be at least, have their power stripped and keep them safely tucked away from society so they can't hurt anyone. But I don't think now I'm thinking about the stockbrokers who go on CNBC and try to play like identity politics with wealth and say that like this is hate speech when people say they want to eat the rich, and it's like I'm not trying to go that far. I'm just trying to say that there are different forms of suffering at every level of the hierarchy of capitalism, and that even the owners are in some way slaves to the system.
If there's any billionaires listening, I want them to know that I think their suffering is the worst.
Or Elon, right?
Yeah, in order to make Marx potentially applicable, I think we have to really widen his terms, right? Like the term of labor, the term of the worker, it has to be expanded, right? It has to include all the work that anybody does, including the capitalist. And then we also have to expand terms like redistribution, right? The profit exists in this system in a weird way, and then the profit has to be sent somewhere above and beyond simply paying back all the things that it took to do the job. And we often talk about redistribution in a way that's ideological, where if I assume the natural thing is for me to get all of the profit, or maybe give some to my executives or shareholders, and then the government wants to take some and not just build roads, but maybe give it to people so they have health care, that strikes me as redistribution. But that's an expression of an uninspected ideological assumption about what normal is, right? And in reality, even paying myself is redistribution. I've taken the profit and I've made some decisions about where it should go. Right. And I think we don't think very clearly about the fact that, paying the owner, paying the shareholders, paying the executives, that all is the same thing as redistribution. We need to make some general decisions about how profit gets distributed. And then the extra weird thing about that is you need profit in order to redistribute it. So like when I look at modern economies, I liked what you were saying about the military as essentially a communist system, because modern economies need whole sectors that are run in a non-capitalist fashion. And every modern economy makes choices about how they distribute the profits. So they're socialist in at least a minimal sense, all of them. And in order to redistribute the profit, you have to have the profit. So all the redistributive systems require capitalism of some kind. So when I look at it, I think modern economies are socialist capitalist. You can't get away from that unless you're going to go totally beyond that and get a different way to get those numbers to run your economy. You're going to have some form of socialist capitalism. You're going to have a profit production mechanism and a redistribution of the profit mechanism somehow. So we're all in socialist capitalisms. And the question is, how do you have a good one? But also, what's next? How could we go beyond this whole thing?
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is like, yeah, I love that we're always in a socialistic capitalism or a capitalistic socialism, and that there's always been a mixed economy. And it was the late great David Graeber who made this point very well, I thought, in several places, but in his book Debt, he talks about how markets and states have always coexisted. You can't have one without the other. You need a coin of the realm that's backed by the state, or you need a state military to enforce contracts and the rights of people who engage in a market. And in the colonial era, the first corporations were backed by the state and given charters to go operate overseas. And the state authority and the market, dynamics were always mutually supporting one another's ambitions. And so we still now, of course, are enmeshed in that sort of relationship. But it's, the question of how we redistribute the profits, as you're saying, and I've only been talking about these two poles, the state and the market, but it's helpful perhaps to switch to a sense of three different sectors of human social existence in the way that Rudolf Steiner does when he talks about social threefolding. There's the realm of politics or the state, the economy, and then also the realm of culture. And the state's there to protect rights. The economy is there to meet our needs and desires, and culture, or like education, media is also in there. That's all for like our spiritual life, which is really, one would hope, maybe one day will become, and I think in the past it certainly was, the center of human existence. That's engaging in cultural creation and worship of various forms, which includes, art just as much as religion, includes lovemaking. It includes all the things that bring highly evolved creatures like conscious human beings joy. That's the cultural realm. And and that should be the center of our existence, whereas the economic and the political is just more like, we need to make sure we feed ourselves, and we get all, they focused on use value mostly. How do we feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, shelter, and how do we pay back the profits made in the economic realm to the cultural realm so that we can keep trying to enhance our experience and evolve our consciousness. And all the government and politics needs to do is, make sure that individuals and groups have as much freedom as is possible without trampling on the rights of other individuals and groups. So that's like the legal sphere, and we will need new laws on occasion, and courts to adjudicate how individuals and groups freely associate. When we need some ground rules, and we need a government to protect people. But yeah, I think it's one of the problems with our current system is how the capitalist economy, has swallowed the state and the political realm as well as the cultural realm, so that all we have left now are commodities. Politicians are commodities that are bought and sold in the marketplace. Culture is a commodity, and so the economy has just been allowed, the capitalist economy has been allowed to completely dominate and take over these other spheres of human existence. And that's a source of great suffering, I think, because people's rights are being taken away, and because we're suffering psychologically. We're stupider than we've ever been. We're more separated from even our own families, and all because of this wage labor system and this alienation of the value of our work from our, and the alienation of ourselves from our own time. Like, we all feel anxious because we don't own our own time, in this system.
Now, again, I'm an ignorant and charitable reader of Marx. I think he says a lot of interesting, positive things about capitalism, and one of them is that it allows people to start thinking about their time as valuable and something that they can choose to dispose of in various ways, right? And that, because previously we didn't think about our time as a source of value. Now you're getting paid for your hour. It is. Now you're in a system that probably sucks for you and most people, but you're still thinking that there should be a better system for you to dispose of your time, because you now are nominally in charge of trading your time for things. It's been given a value. So I agree with Marx that that's a good thing that capitalism brought in. Just hasn't totally fulfilled the promises, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a great example of the dialectic at work. In Hegel's master-slave dialectic, there's something that the slave becomes capable of learning as a result of being subjected to the rule of the master, which is both the slave's the one engaging with the material world, which is increasing its sense of agency in relationship to nature, and then the slave is also gaining moral superiority over the master, because the master's just lazy and slothful and takes everything for granted, and meanwhile the slave has just recognize the relationship between time and labor. And so, yeah, if we were to redistribute things in a more just way, people would be paid for their labor. Women would be paid for their labor in terms of being the member of this half of the species that produces new members of the species. Like, that's a labor that capitalism has obviously totally depended on. You need, for capitalism and the economy to continue to grow, you need populations to continue to grow, and that's a lot of unpaid labor that we're asking mostly women to do. And so, yeah, maybe this increased consciousness of time will increasingly lead people, women and their allies, to fight for adequate redistribution of the profit that their labor produced, and among many other people who are being exploited. So this raising of consciousness of our time is, that's a good thing to highlight. Very important.
You were talking about this imbalance between the state and the economy and the culture. And, if there's a factor in the economy, in the way we run the economy, that constantly produces a real and or virtual excess amount, a bonus of some kind, right? If it's constantly giving itself more than it's using up, then it's going to have, first of all, individual profits, but then in general, a growth of that sector, right? There's going to be a growth mentality, an embedded growth obligation within economy. It's got to keep swelling up. It's got to keep moving forward. It's got to keep expanding in order to get a function within the structure that it's set up for itself. And that makes it, or could make it, larger and more dominant relative to those other two sectors, right? That the state and the culture are not necessarily in a constant expansion mode. But if the economy goes into a constant expansion mode, then how could it not sort of overrule, dominate, and distort those other two sectors?
By freely giving its profits back to the cultural sphere. And it's like, I think the way Steiner imagined it would be that the economy was more of a cooperative endeavor rather than hyper-competitive and inherently seeking monopoly. And because that's this sort of endless growth that starts to look a lot like cancer. Whereas we would want the economy ideally to be an organ that's producing things of value that allow us to thrive culturally. And if it's not doing that, then it's sick. And so rather than seeing profit as something to be paid out in dividends to shareholders or reinvested by means of like buying out your competitors so that you can become even larger, rather than using profits for that purpose, you use profits to make sure everyone has healthcare and to make sure everyone can get an education and go through the highest degree that they can, that they're capable of, and pursue whatever subject they want to study, because that is of benefit to, the collective intelligence of our species. And so the economy serves humanity ultimately, instead of humanity serving the economy, which is the way that the economy, quote unquote, gets talked about in most of the major newspapers, is increasingly infuriating to me, because of how obvious the disconnect between the financial markets and the real economy, how obvious the disconnects are. So when we talk about the economy, we need to be more specific, right? When 90% of the money in circulation is just financialized derivatives, and money owed on future things that may or may not happen.
It is really emotionally and morally upsetting to see the gap between an apparently failing economy and an increasingly rising GDP, which is the total number of profits divided by the number of citizens. It doesn't mean any of those citizens are getting any of that.
Right.
It's a very disturbing gap, and it's a gap that, whether or not it's what Marx predicted, it's a gap that cannot indefinitely continue, and morally should be hindered at maximum speed.
Yeah.
Another thing that comes up to me, though, is like there's one kind of thinking, which is, should we run a system this way? Should underserving some of the numbers to get profit out and using profit as the incentive to get people to set up ventures and have these ventures be competitive and, run that forward, the kind of economy we've got, which produces some really good things, but also sabotages a bunch of really good things. Should we let go of that and make an entirely different kind of economy that is not driven by the production of an excess amount, a profit? Or should we just do it in a really smart way, right? Which is questions like, who decides about the redistribution of the profit? Should all the workers get a democratic say in a corporate enterprise of which they are a part? Should the government come in and say to them where those profits should be redistributed to? Should the on paper owner of the enterprise get to make all those decisions? So there's a whole open question about who gets to decide. And in a cooperative enterprise, in theory, all the people who are involved get to co-decide through democratic mechanisms of collective intelligence where that redistribution should go. And if we had those instead of the kind of authoritarian or cabal of executives and major shareholders kind of organizations, would we have a system of profit making where the redistribution was nice enough and good enough that we could guarantee general well-being and forward motion as a civilization? Is that good enough? Or do we really have to look at this other question and say, how do we run a system without a profit incentive? Does that make sense? I'm trying to draw a contrast, but I'm not sure if it's coming across or not.
Well, I hear the problem you're articulating, which is who decides how to redistribute. And if we have centralized command and control economies, the historical examples we have of that haven't worked all that well. China switched to being a bit more market friendly, but with still a lot of centralized control. And they seem to have found a good balance, good in the sense of like they industrialize their country and more of their population than any other people in world history, for good and for ill. Because it would, for ill in the sense that we're going to actually, it seems to me, need more people who are farming in the future than living in cities, rather than the trend in the 20th century towards the cities. That's the wrong direction. We need to be running from the cities. We'll still have cities, I think, but in any event, how do you decide how this profit gets redistributed? Or do you try to rationally design your economy well enough so that it's steady state and you only produce as much as you need? I mean, I think there's we need to look at this I think we can do both at once at this, in a sense, where instead of the labor of workers being exploited, you have worker-owned cooperatives so that you can keep your corporate structure, but it's worker-owned. And as you said, there's democratic decision-making processes in place. And it doesn't mean that you don't have managers at your worker co-op and entry-level people. There's an internal decision-making process whereby everyone agrees these are the people with expertise that we want in these positions, and there's a clear way to move up in the company when you've been there for a while and you're good at your job, and you work all this stuff out democratically. And there's a sense of just distribution of the earnings of the company within the company. But then, I think we can still allow for profit to be made by this co-op, but the workers are going to decide what to do with that profit. And I would think, let's say they're in a particular neighborhood, maybe they're going to want to say, let's invest this profit in a great school system for our kids, or let's invest in a thriving community garden, or let's invest in the community health center, because we're all going to benefit from that as workers, and so will our families. And because the situation, I think, in the ideal that Steiner was imagining with this threefolding situation, is that the government would not be taxing as much, because there would be more free there would be more gifting from the economic sector in the form of philanthropy, because the problem with the government deciding what to do with all the profit that it would be taxing, say, is that it's centralized too much. And you want to leave the decision making, I think, to the people in their local contexts, rather than having a command and control economy. And so this assumes that human nature is not selfish and greedy. It assumes that people can actually cooperatively engage in the context of a business without, as a sense of internal struggle to like be the one who gets the promotion and sabotage your coworkers so that you look better in the eyes of your boss. Or, I mean, these are dynamics that seem also natural to human beings. But if there's a way, I think if there's a way forward towards a more cooperative economic model, we're going to have to draw on the better angels of our nature. I can't believe I used that metaphor because I know Pinker loves it and used it for his book, and we're pretty opposite, on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. But in any event, it's true. Are human beings inherently selfish and profit seeking in the sense that it would be profit for oneself or one's own family or tribe, or do we have some altruistic longing for a harmony and a happiness that would extend beyond ourselves? I think we have both tendencies, and that capitalism emphasizes and puts us in situations where we're forced to be greedy, to get whatever we can get from this competitive game, this battlefield of being a worker trying to sell your labor to a company. And we're only now just beginning to talk about a $15 federal minimum wage. It's like poor and working people have been getting the short end of the stick for so long. It's surprising there hasn't been a revolution yet. It's sure. Surprising. It's overdue.
Everything we do have was the result of a fight, right? If we didn't have to be involved in that particular fight, then it's kind of murky to us. But like in the United States is looking at this $15 minimum wage thing, the system would happily pay $1 an hour, right? The system would happily have a 7-day work week, all these sorts of things. Every
8-year-olds in the coal mine,
the result of somebody actually fighting and sacrificing themselves to oppose the normal momentum of this kind of economic mode, which does have its positive side, but it has all these negative sides and may have an inbuilt self-sabotage mechanism. I want to get back to the emotional element of profit, which I think you touched on. But first, I want to say, I'm very pro cooperatives in general. It seems to me that your business life is a huge part of your life. And if you only have democracy in the state and you don't have democracy at work, then you don't live in a democracy. And of course, you're going to be alienated from your fucking labor. But I don't know that it's the same at every scale of business, like mom and pop porn shop or whatever they're running. They don't necessarily have to have a legal system say you need some kind of democratic voting mechanism, but there may be some kind of cutoff. And I think this is a really under-theorized element of our system in general, is where is the public threshold, right? Like with the internet, are enough people using it that it is a public service or a common carrier of some kind? Like at what point of an operation do we say, look, that operation is big enough, it concerns everybody now. And so you have to let all of the participants combine their intelligence to determine how you will do it and what the distribution of the rewards will be. So that's really interesting to me. But I'm also thinking about, sorry to throw a whole bunch of things in here, but there's a kind of, I don't know what the underlying structure of the cosmos is. If the underlying structure of the cosmos is balanced, then profit is a perversion. But if the underlying structure of the universe is not balanced, then accumulation or some kind of positive gradient might be correct mapping of the structure of things. Like there were a lot of early modernist mystics who said, look, you got an unconditional reality, that's world zero, and you got a conditional reality, and that if that's a +1 and a -1, then the equation balances. Dualism on this side, nothingness on that side, it all works out great. But if instead of assigning a 0 to the realm of potential, we assign a -1, then the manifest universe has to constantly be a +1 just to break even. So like, I don't think we totally know whether the universe should be understood as a balance from which we deviate, or as a slope or a gradient where an imbalance is in fact a correct description of that. You know, a really sophisticated capitalist might make that argument. The universe itself is skewed, and therefore if we don't have a skewed economic system, we're not being true to reality.
Yeah, I think capitalism is an expression of something cosmic, about something. Capitalism clearly has tapped into this creative flow of energy. I mean, the universe is not a perfect equilibrium. It's not at thermodynamic equilibrium. It's the only way to explain in a physical sense the current level of organization in the universe is to posit a state of high order at the beginning, or a state of very low entropy at the beginning. And this is sort of the one free miracle that physical cosmologists ask you to give them. I think someone like, Alfred North Whitehead, or the German nature philosopher Friedrich Schelling would want to point instead to the way that nature is not just a movement towards equilibrium. It's not just entropic. It's also creative and self-organizing. And there's a polar relationship between a -1 and a +1, as you said. And for whatever reason, these poles are not in stasis, they're in dynamic relationship. And so to correct for each one of their own opposite energy, they sort of oscillate. And evolution is this unfolding oscillation of these poles, searching for, or in some way always orbiting a hidden center, but never repeating the same movement towards that center twice. And so the accumulation at a cosmological level is an accumulation of it's an accumulation of everything that has ever occurred, but in each moment, and this is Whitehead's understanding of concrescence, right? It is an accumulation of everything that has ever occurred, as well as everything that remains possible in light of that past. And Whitehead is a process philosopher, and he's evolutionary. He's evolutionary in his orientation, but there's also a sense in which he's saying each moment of our existence participates fully in whatever we might mean by eternity. Eternity, if it is anything, is fully present now. It's not elsewhere than the flow of time. It's fully present in each moment, and yet each moment is new, because the universe does not repeat itself. And I think there's a way in which capitalism has unleashed this power of novelty, perhaps, and has canceled the entropy gradient, the thermodynamic gradient on the surface of the earth more efficiently than any mode of production prior, where we can even go beyond humans, the mode of production of photosynthesis. All the other animal species haven't been able to harvest free energy at the rate that industrial capitalism has. I mean, we're drilling deep into the earth to harvest the decayed remains of dinosaurs and prehistoric plants to burn this oil, to release entropy at such a clip, that we're ushering in a new geological era, or potentially epoch, a much larger geological shift. So yeah, capitalism's natural, and human beings are free moral creatures who I think need to perhaps take the reins of the mode of production in a more conscious way than they've been able to as of yet, because there's not much future left for unconsciousness in our species. We're going to kill ourselves if we can't figure this out.
Consciousness, ecology, and the subjectivity of profit. There's so much in there. I think about if the cosmos has a gradient, if more is part of the intrinsic nature of things, then that has consequences for how we look at things like ecology, right? And this is very integral, right? There's potentially a pre-trans version of this, where the pre-version is the universe is stable and pre-given, and we've deviated from that, and so we should fall back and do less. That will solve the Anthropocene. If we just got rid of us and the things we're doing and renormalized, we would be fine. The transposition might be a little bit like, hey, what we need is more of the kind of nature that we like, that we have observed is good for biodiversity and the thriving of our species. I wonder if we could make more than there is, right? So these are two different kinds of solutions, and one is a lessness, return to balance solution, and the other one plays into this same kind of capitalist logic. And you could critique it, saying it's flawed by the logic and metaphysics of capitalism and modernity, or you could say that metaphysics reflects something about reality, and we should be thinking about ecology in terms of how could we make a profit? How could we make a more naturalness? So that intrigues me. I love what you were saying about Whitehead, because there's a sort of, you have the world and then eternity is here as well. That's like the world plus something. Or you have eternity, but you also have the situation of the novelty of the world. So it's eternity plus something. In both cases, somebody's making a profit in a sense. There's an extra involved because of the conjunction of those two different dimensions of being. Yeah,
it's just a question. So profit is not necessarily bad, but is it profit as gift or profit as theft? And I think it's clear that the universe produces gifts. It's not that, at the level of like our biological existence and predators and their prey, and the sense in which, as Whitehead admits, life is robbery. That's true, but it's always the higher organisms feeding on the lower organisms. And so in this way, the robber is justified, Whitehead says, because of the nature of gradients. Energy gradients in nature is such that more higher organization exists atop lower organization. There is a hierarchy. And this is, a point that Wilber made in Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality that made a lot of waves, trying to say that we can't just feminize the hierarchies away without losing the fundamental structure of the cosmos in the process. And so we need to distinguish between pathological and holarchical forms of these levels, right? And I think capitalism represents a pathological form of hierarchy where it's sort of arbitrary. It's like, why should some people who are no less capable, no less intelligent when it comes down to it, be forced to be subjected to the life of a poor or working class person with very little opportunity for escape from that, whereas other people are born into such tremendous wealth that their biggest problem is figuring out how to get rid of it. That is the result of a very traumatic history that didn't involve the sort of consciousness that I think more of us are now capable of. And this gets back to that emotional piece. There's such tremendous healing that needs to take place, and it begins, for each of us in our own relationships. It begins with how we see one another, in the few opportunities we have for personal contact with members of the general public nowadays, people have to work at the grocery store. It's one of the few places I go anymore, and I know them all very well now. Very well. I don't know them all very well. What I mean is that we know each other. I'm there once a week, and this exchange, this market exchange, is increasingly, I feel like both of us, both sides, myself and whoever's checking me out, we're feeling this sense of like, well, here we are again. Neither of us really thinks this is a just situation, but hope you're having a good day. And so it feels like the pressure cooker is really turned on high now with the pandemic, and human beings are undergoing an accelerated evolutionary mutation, and the pace of change just keeps on quickening, and the only source of hope I have is that it can't go on much longer. Just at least something, even if it's completely a destructive thing that we're on the verge of, at least it'll end the anxiety of the squeeze and the sense of isolation that I think so many are feeling now.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are feeling that, and there's a lot of, anybody who's thinking about how systems ought to function has to be able to take really seriously the vulnerability that everybody is exposed to under the current situation, right? Like, it's not just, maybe I'll get COVID or maybe I lost my job. I don't know what reality is. I don't know if we can have a meaningful continuation of a system like the one that we're in. That's a deep exposure. That's a deep risk. When you were talking about gift and theft, and I immediately was like, are there other options? Is there something besides those two? Because I think the pro-capitalist, I think, probably makes a pretty legitimate argument that
for trade, right?
You put something at stake in making an exchange, which isn't necessarily a gift or a theft. It's a deal that you make, and you make that deal. And I have a lot of complaints about Friedrich Hayek, but I think one of the things he was onto was that these exchanges can be a vehicle for collective intelligence to figure out how to organize things in a distributed way. So I don't want to take that away from it.
I think I'm more, you're helping me clarify that it's a spectrum between gift and theft, and that most of our economic exchanges take place somewhere in between the two, right? And so it's more about finding the balance, and things seem to be so much on the side of theft now that I'm heightening the contrast by really differentiating the two. But you're right. Yeah, it's the juice is in the tension between the two, where you get a productive, novelty producing economy going, right? Where there's trades that are made, and both parties in the agreement benefit temporarily by the contract that they form. And it's just a matter of raising the baseline a little bit for the people who are on the wage or the labor side of the contract, because right now there aren't enough jobs for the workers. And so the people, it's a spectrum. And I just think we need to move more to the side of redistribution to a greater number of people than the current process of redistribution from the many to the fewer and fewer.
Raising the bottom seems so essential. When I try to do an analysis of modern economics, it has this kind of trickle-down effect. But the problem is it's designed for people to make a profit by skimming flows. Imbalances are created, and there's a flow to rebalance that imbalance, and somebody gets a little off the flow, like a water wheel profiting from the river. Why was I saying that? Oh, yeah, because if you trickle down, each one of those trickles is a flow that somebody skims. And after a couple of levels, there's nothing left. Everybody's skimmed it already. So you can't really do it that way. In my mind, the other one is the counter analogy is the bottom of the bucket lifts all the water. If I got a rope and a bucket and it's full of water, that rope has to lift the bottom of the bucket. If it lifts the bottom of the bucket, all the water goes up. So that's, I think probably more apt than the rising tide lifts all ships, because we've seen a so-called rising tide in terms of increasing GDP, and most of the ships have not been lifted.
Yeah, for sure. And, people like Steven Pinker will point to the way that in the last decades or the last century that more people have been lifted out of poverty than ever before by the introduction of capitalist markets. And I think it's deceptive to frame it that way, because what lifting them out of poverty means is that, well, on this date, they were only making $1 a day and now they're making $2 a day. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
They doubled their income. And it's like,
we put them into the system where the increase is occurring.
Right. But we also destroyed their subsistence. Not only did we make them wage slaves, but we destroyed their more agriculturally sustainable local subsistence lifestyle and all the culture that went with that, and brought them into Pepsi and Disney World and having to work for a living. And so, okay, they're not in poverty, but who's to say that what looks like an impoverished existence from a modern Western capitalist perspective actually might not be productive of happiness, at least as well as, having a tiny apartment and working 9 to 5.
It's really tricky, because from the, vaguely integral point of view, you want to say, look, there's something really good about modern values in capitalism. It's played its role. It's really been a dynamic engine of human progress. And there's a lot of truth to that. But it's cost us a lot of valuable things at the same time. It's driven technological innovation, but it's also suppressed technological innovation, right? It's given us things and it's taken things away. And so it's really hard to get an objective overall appreciation for what capitalism has been doing. It's not as simple as it just helped a lot of people get out of poverty and incentivized a lot of new technological production. It also did the opposite of those things. So even if it did those things, it did far less of them on the whole than we tend to appreciate it for.
Yeah, it's like too much transcendence, not enough inclusion, of these earlier forms of social organization. In the agricultural aspect of the ecological crisis, I think, is at least as severe as climate change, which most people are always talking about climate change. And, a few years ago when the Green New Deal got introduced, for a second, people were talking about, we have to change how we eat too. It's like, yeah. And so the industrial agriculture is too much transcendence and not enough inclusion of the old subsistence lifestyles and lifeways. And so that's a need for capitalism and the productive powers it has unleashed to slow down, go back and see how it was done for tens of thousands, 10,000 years at least. And even earlier than that, we might need to consider some sectors of the population that are living more of a kind of nomadic lifestyle, depending on the population trajectory in the next century. I mean, so far we're dealing mostly now with this biological threat, but I heard it only took, 15 days into the Biden administration or something, and his Secretary of State Blinken is like rattling sabers at Iran. And so we could end up with if we have a full scale of war again, that's only going to compound the economic and social unraveling, so hang on tight, right? I don't think we've reached the bottom of this.
Of the system are, because I immediately, war with Iran, that's a lot of flows to skim, right? So it's totally incentivized by the system and the people who do well from the system, but with extraordinary collateral damage onto the rest of the population and onto the ecosystemic dynamics of the planet. And seems to be, you could make an argument that the kind of imbalance that capitalism represents is a really good driver of progress. But that's a very narrow view, in the sense that when you zoom out and you look at all the people involved and all the systems upon which we depend, there's so much collateral damage from the process that even if it was what it claimed to be, and I'm not convinced it is, but even if it was, it might not be worth the damage that it causes in a larger sphere of observations.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism, industrial capitalism, mortgaged the future with this fossil fuel fueled economy, and we're going to have to pay back that debt. All of that entropy released into the atmosphere and all of that destruction of the earth is going to feed back onto us. And unless we're able to transform our mode of production such that we're enabled in some way able to harvest the chaos we've already set in motion to produce a profit from it somehow energetically. And and we don't just need a new source of energy and a new way of growing our food. We need a way to undo the damage economically that we've already, like, in other words, we need to find a way to turn a profit on cleaning up the fucking mess that was made by capitalism. Because I don't think, as we were talking about earlier, that we're going to do away with profit, or that we should. It's more just, what do you reinvest those profits in? So it's more about our values, I guess, and that level of evolution and transformation is not something you're going to read much about in the newspapers or see on cable news. It takes place sort of offline in the remaining unmediated spaces, and we can still talk about it and meme about it in these digital spaces, but at the end of the day, it's still just talk until it's not. And I feel like a lot of people are right at that edge of talking a lot about all the things that need to happen and then making the decisions, because we're at the point now where planning a future in the existing system feels more precarious and risky than bailing out of the system and trying to do it some totally different way.
Look, we've got kids here, and you got to make decisions about education. You're like, what are we educating them for? Like, where is this going? Do they need to be adapted well to a system, or do we need to think in terms of intersystem skills or spontaneous skill acquisition or something like that? Because I have no confidence that anything that's going on right now is going to hold. And I don't know whether that's because the systems are fundamentally fragile, or if I'm being deluded by an information problem. Like, there's so much informational opacity that I can't trust or believe anything just because my experience of data is so occluded. I have no idea whether I'm getting a correct impression of the world, but the impression I get is all bets are off, mass peculiarity is going up, and anybody who's trying to project out the current systems beyond a few years is probably making a huge mistake about the future.
Yeah. I mean, I can think back to like a couple of years ago, feeling like, oh, what? Digital currency? Like, you want me to, why would I invest in that? And now I'm with like a savings account in USD wondering, like, that seems like a risky proposition to just keep all my money in US dollars. Given the titanic shifts that appear to be occurring. But at the end of the day, like I feel like I can't tell to what extent the media that I digest is a psyop, and to what extent am I living in a simulation. I'm learning the lesson of epistemic humility every day, but I think there's important work to be done, I think, in terms of educating the young in exactly that, like epistemic humility, but also just epistemology in general. Like, how do we know what we know, and what is it important to know? I think we need now the capacity to filter information at such a high velocity and level of complexity. And my sense is that younger kids younger people are better at it than adults, just in the sense that I don't know. I watch some of these memes that the young people are making, and they're so dense. It's semantically dense and information rich, and there's so many levels of irony and sincerity, which is that whole meta modern move. And it's the degree of processing. I think the kids are going to be okay, is what I'm saying, one way or another. But I just turned 35 a few days ago, and I know that's not quite middle-aged, but I definitely am starting to see young people and feel like they're alien, in relation to how I see the world. And I used to feel like I was part of the young crowd, and I'm not there anymore.
I think that's a sweet spot. Somebody asked me a couple of years ago, how old are you? And I said, young enough to hate old people, but old enough to hate young people now.
Yeah.
I think that's ideal. You got the whole spectrum covered.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I think about the information density, as long as the kids are getting the kind of emotional support and sense-making tactics that you need for that. I mean, I look at, The Office and Arrested Development were things that happened in my lifetime. I'm looking at these kids. This is what they're watching. This is their first thing. They're not watching Three's Company or Saved by the Bell and moving on to The Office. They're starting at The Office. That's incredibly referentially and informationally rich and complex.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of confidence in their cognitive capacity to adapt. But I'm worried that a lot of people are not going to have the emotional and social supports and skill orientations necessary to use that cognitive complexity in a way that brings forth a world of well-being.
Yeah, it's the emotional part that is worrying. That's true, because especially if they're not even able to go to school for who knows how long. I know some districts are just opening up, but others are not. And I can't imagine my childhood without school. I mean, as much as it was torture half the time, it was so formative, like being forced to be in those social relationships and navigate the, cliques and all the dynamics. And what if all they have are their screens and their parents at home? Like, gosh, it's brave new world. I had this desire over the winter break. For some reason, Twitter kept feeding me ads for like the Oculus Rift, and I was like, I could use a little extra exercise. Why don't I get one of those VR things and play some tennis with a robot? And then I was taking out the trash and at my apartment complex here, and I saw through the window this little girl playing with an Oculus Rift she couldn't even see the giant flat screen TV on taking up the whole wall in front of her, but she's like playing this sword dance game, and it just struck me that, like, when you see that from the outside, you realize the trajectory that we're on if consumer capitalism kind of continues, and it scared the shit out of me, because that is the type of reality that kids now are. That's what their video games are. They're just so much more immersive and so much more like Zelda, when I was a kid, was already immersive enough to make me forget to eat, or even though I had to pee, I would hold it for an hour just because I was having so much fun playing this game. And it's like, oh man, the level of disconnect and alienation. And Elon Musk's just about to release his Neuralink thing, and that's only gonna. Can you imagine the kids that Zoomers are gonna have? Like, just fast forward in one more generation, and it's beyond my ability to fathom just one generation from now.
There's so many variables in play where each one of them could transform in such a massive fashion as to undermine our entire intuition about what it means to be human beings. So yes, we need to solve ecology, and yes, we need to solve economic inequality and things, but that's not going to take away the fact that everything is getting fucking weird really fast. And it's not slowing down. It's not going to stop. You have to be able to adapt to that, or it's going to hit you like a trauma.
Yep. Yeah.
There's another thing I wanted to address on this topic, and I'm in my own ear, I'm like, I talked to Jim Rutt yesterday, so I feel like I'm using a like American radio voice a little more than I normally would.
He's got a good one.
Your voice sounds so like relaxed and authentic. I think I'm pushing it a little bit. Uh, I want to talk about the subjective aspect of all this. Like, what's a good, like, does consciousness make a profit? You know, because I've spent a bunch of my life being a spiritual teacher and a meditation teacher. And one of the ways you could describe mindfulness is like making a profit on your perceptions rather than just having them, detecting the novelty, detecting the coherence, detecting the beingness of the things that you're experiencing rather than just experiencing them. So there's that aspect of like, can you make a profit in consciousness? There's like profit relative to homeostasis. Guy wins the lottery, $10 million. He has a great week, and then his emotions renormalize. So he, relative to whatever his baseline is, he only got this brief moment of emotional profit. And emotional profit is also, I don't want to say, the Jordan Peterson lobster shit. Like when you experience the feeling of a win, pumps out chemicals, you change, you become more competent. When you experience the chemicals of a loss, you get worse at doing the things you want to do. So it's important to be able to feel like we're making an emotional profit. If I'm not getting an experience that seems above and beyond my normal level of experience, I'm somehow losing touch with meaning and losing touch with my even physical capacity to operate as a competent organism. So yeah, all that stuff is what's on my mind relative to the subjectivity of profit.
Yeah, well, I mean, in order for us to motivate ourselves to do anything, to improve ourselves, we have to believe that we can. I mean, it's like I think that's a tautology, but it's like if it's not possible to progress in our own development by working at it, practicing, then there is no, that I think there wouldn't even be consciousness. That is what consciousness is that process of self-improvement and self-cultivation. And
Are you existentially investing the capital to get a profit then in that process?
Well, to the extent that you are the owner of yourself, it's as if, if everyone got to be a capitalist, then we wouldn't have capitalism, right? Because there's no labor to exploit. If everyone owned themselves fully and had an authentic relationship to their own time and energy expenditure and got, capitalists make a profit.
I just want to interrupt you for a second and say that the way you're framing that is beautiful, because you're describing something that is true of socialism and libertarianism simultaneously.
We'll say more about that. I mean,
well, it's like if everybody owned their own time and value, if everybody was a capitalist, right? If we each individually had the liberty of the controllers of the system and no intermediary was fucking with that, then we would A, have a much more socialist system, B, have a much more libertarian system.
Right. Yeah.
And exactly. I don't think, honestly, I don't really think there's political progress that's possible for anybody who's not combining those two somehow.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, and this eliminates the bad profit, or it helps us offset how far we're leaning toward theft as the mode of the profit that we're making, because when there's a labor class, a working class, and a capitalist class, the capitalist class makes a profit by forcing the workers to work more than is required for them to reproduce themselves and to get their own needs met. They pay them, the capitalist pays the worker whatever the wage is, which is some small percentage of the total value that had been created by that labor. So if everyone was a capitalist, what that just means is that, the work that you do produces a profit for you to decide what to do with, instead of for someone else to take from you without you even realizing or being conscious of the fact that they're stealing from you, because of the nature of the system that you're embedded within, that blinds you from the true relationship of worker to owner, and that blinds you from the labor theory of value, and makes you desire commodities that you think, you're gonna, the little bit of money that you're paid for your labor just gets given back to the corporations and the owners, because you buy the commodities that they produce that you don't even really need. So it's by not allowing everyone the dignity of being the owners of themselves, we end up with this exploitative economic system. And so, yeah, I think I'm glad that you pointed that out. I didn't quite see it, that we can make the socialists and the libertarians and the capitalists happy all in one fell swoop. Expand capitalism, democratize it. Everyone should be a capitalist.
It was a thing you just touched on there about encouraging people to have desires they don't necessarily have or need, and that's one of the essential, interesting, weird things about modern economies, is they include marketing, which is the science of trying to get people to want things they don't necessarily want. It's a psyop. It's designed to distort your desire in order to make the system run, which is very interesting. And I think the classical economists had run on the labor theory of value, and Marx extrapolated from that. And then a lot of neoclassical economists switched to supply and demand in much respect as a way to distance themselves from what Marx was saying. And the supply and demand argument is very interesting. On the one hand, you could say it's actually just labor value, because the supply and demand of what, right? It's only rare to me if I don't have the time to go and get it myself in a reasonable fashion. So supply and demand is to some extent just a gloss on the labor theory of value. But it also has this relativistic, this subjective element, right? Where it's just whatever anybody wants and doesn't have. And that's almost a postmodern kind of argument. But the problem with that is there's an immediate incentive to make people want things. And so there's the birth of an industry trying to convince people of their desires rather than adapt to their desires. Yep. That's fascinating to me. And that's one of the places I see, when I was a kid, when I was a really little kid, I just had stupid ideas about Marx. I thought, everybody was, the state would own the wheelbarrow, just retarded 12-year-old notions. Yeah. When I got a little older, the first thing I thought was like, oh, surplus value was McDonald's, because every picture of French fries glowed with a golden aura. And I'm like, where did we get that golden aura? Where's that extra coming from? Right? It's that extra is the degree to which it makes me want a thing I don't even necessarily want. That's the extra in that. So modernity worries me as a system of black magic. It's designed to have you persuade the minds of others. Yeah. And that's a deep and disturbing part of contemporary capitalism.
Yeah, capitalist sorcery. As there's a Whiteheadian philosopher named Isabel Stengers who views capitalism not as a form of disenchantment, but and secularization, but rather as a form of a new form of enchantment itself, because of the role that the PR industry and marketing plays, and the advertising industry plays in manipulating people at the psychic and emotional and sexual levels. And it's part of this, again, this split between use value and exchange value, where in capitalism, the value of a commodity is, well, whatever the market says it is. And it becomes a very subjective, easily manipulated thing. And it's kind of funny to see these talking heads on CNBC lately responding to the, GameStop's stock price going up, and they're all like, that's not its real value, and these Redditors are disturbing the perfect capitalist system of creating prices, that it used to be rational, and now they're disturbing the rationality. And it's I mean, there are so many things under capitalism that from a human and ecological point of view should not be valued nearly as highly as they are. There are entire industries that don't even need to exist. I mean, I know it's like, I don't want to trespass into the domain of art because art is beautiful, but art as a commodity under capitalism leads to something like the fashion industry. And, you know, Walter Benjamin wrote about this in Paris 100 years ago, the fashion industry being a way for the elites to allow the working class people to feel like they were getting ahead because they can wear these trendy new clothes now. And it creates the illusion of a ladder where you can move up, you know? So we need to question, with whatever reserves of willpower and strength we have, with whatever spiritual sources of, you know, whatever spiritual anchors we have, we need to question the extent to which we are desiring things that we don't actually want, and subjecting ourselves to a regime of work and labor in order to have enough money to get things that we think we want that we don't actually want. And, you know, that's a daily struggle, you know, for me, just thinking about not only products and goods and services and stuff that I don't really need but want, but also just thinking of relationally and socially, and, you know, the drive to reproduce. Like, am I caught up in the capitalist growth model, or is this an innate desire that I have to participate in the furthering of life, you know? And maybe it's a little bit of each. But yeah, we're subjected to the most well-funded psyop in world history on the daily. Every time we doom scroll or check our email or Google something, so we're assaulted by it constantly.
I'm torn because you know, on the one hand, I realize that I'm in a psyop where, from the moment I was born, individually and socially, my head was being screwed with a set of desires I don't necessarily want.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I do want to make a lot of space for the validity of desires that don't seem to be needs, right? I think that all my life you run into people and they say, yeah, do you need that or do you just want that? And I'm like, where did that just come from? Because, you know, is there maybe fried chicken and daily sex is exactly what I need? Why are why are you putting a special privileged class of needs apart from the rest of the things that I idiosyncratically derive value from?
Right.
So I'm torn on that one. Another thing that interests me about this a lot is just what doesn't get counted in the current system. Like, would capitalism work really well if we counted everything? Because we know people are polluting. They're not paying for that. It's not one of the costs of their business. There's a legal structure which says they don't have to pay it.
Right.
Just like there's a legal structure that says, you know, the mother does the housework and raises the kids. We don't have to pay her. It's legally removed from, you know, the profit book, the cost book. So I don't know if we put all that stuff in the book, if we stopped excluding things, if we enfolded the externalities, would capitalism function really well in a multidimensional sense of achieving well-being? I don't know. We've never tried it.
If we had an economic bill of rights, I think it would be worth experimenting and seeing what the answer to that question is. You know, if we had a workers' bill of rights, did I say economic bill of rights? I mean, like, if workers had, if every human being was guaranteed healthcare and education and housing and at least the foundation of, or the bottom floor that would afford them the possibility to participate in the market, then we could have another go at capitalism. But we've never had that, and I'm not sure we would even be able to call it capitalism anymore.
Exactly. If we had we've never tried a free market. We've never tried pricing all the things we value. So it's really difficult to determine whether this system works or not, because we don't actually have any test cases of a free market being implemented.
Right. Hey, Layman, I'm going to have to run here in a few minutes.
No problem. I want to ask you a personal question, because I've been listening to something as you speak the whole time, and I'm like, why is this guy who looks like he's 12, why does he love Walter Benjamin and Rudolf Steiner and Marx and Schelling? What is it about the pre-20th century? When did you get excited about the pre-20th century, Matt?
Oh, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. History is fascinating. When I was a kid, my favorite kind of movie was like historical fiction that was like recreating some scene from history that I'd heard a little bit about. It was like I really wanted to see what happened, not just have the dates and the name of the war or whatever. But so yeah, I don't know. I think honestly, I didn't get into reading at all until I was like 17. It wasn't like I'd read books that seemed interesting when I was younger and things I was assigned, but I wasn't obsessed until 17 when I read a novel actually by Joseph Heller, Catch-22.
Great book.
And it just brought me into the absurdity of war and history in a way, because it's like about, it's historical fiction again, right? And it gave me a new perspective on the expanses of my own imagination and how various texts and studying the past can deepen my perception of the present. And I've just been obsessed with reading ever since. And there's so much to read. And some of, the thinkers you mentioned and the others that I like that were more recent, they write in a way philosophically that's at the edge of our evolution as a species. And so, in other words, it's really hard to understand what they're trying to say. And so it repays multiple readings, and each reading brings greater depth, and I can connect more of the dots, and it repays, I feel like a profit is made each time. Like I haven't squeezed all the juice out of these texts yet. And so I keep reading them and talking about them and writing about them. And hopefully, that provides raw material for future thinkers and scholars to continue to work with and mold and use for whatever their purposes are and needs are in the future.
Took me a long time to read Catch-22, but I had a friend named Milo when I was a kid, and my dad would call him Milo Minderbinder. And it led me to watch the movie early on. So I'd probably seen it a dozen times by the time I was 15. Oh. Loved it. Anyway, fantastic conversation, Matt. Let's do this again soon sometime. I think these
always fun.
These are the cutting edge topics of the moment.
Yeah. Thanks, Layman, for this conversation and all the work you do at Integral Stage. You guys have been just pumping out great, interesting, entertaining content. So keep it up.